Hey, how's it going everyone? Welcome to part 10 on a series where I show you how to build a simple modern habit tracker called consistency. So in the last part, we basically built out the front end as well as the Redux state for the sign-in component. And we also implemented local storage to make sure our user doesn't disappear upon refresh. So in this video, we're going to be continuing and building out the backend for signing in. And then afterwards, we'll build out the logout functionality. So let's get started with this sign-in backend. First of all, make sure your front end and your server is running if you're following along with the tutorial. And also, open up your user routes file, which is in the backend under the routes folder. All right, here we started creating the sign-in route, and all we did was have a test user, and we returned that back to the front end just to make sure it was working. But here, what we want to actually do is some input validation to make sure that the email and password the user entered is valid. And we also need to check if the email exists in our system, which will, if they're signing in, should be the case. And we also need to check if the password from the database matches the password that they entered. So let's start with this first part over here. We actually already did very similar error checking up here in the register route. So we basically have a function called user info validation. And in here, we have a bunch of body functions that check certain fields for us and return specific error messages like so. So what we're going to do basically is use this function before the handler function for signing in over here like this. And this time we're going to give it sign in because the checks that we're going to be doing for sign in are different than registering. And remember, when we want to actually get the errors that this function returns, we need to use this validation result function that comes from express validator, and any errors that gets returned from this function gets saved into our constant. So I'm going to take this line, and also this if statement here checks if the errors are not empty. If that's the case, then we're going to return a 401 error and send errors.array back to the front end. So I'm going to take all of these lines over here from register route and put it into the sign-in route. But like I said, the tests that we do for signing in are different than registering. So let's go up to the validation results function. Sorry, the user info validation function. So we have a case here for registering and we do all these checks. Let's make a case for signing in and handle the cases for that. So it's going to return an array of errors. And the first one that we're obviously going to check is if the email exists and if it's a valid email. So I'm going to copy this function from the register case and put it into here for the sign-in array. Next, we need to check if the password that they entered is of valid length and if it exists. So I'm going to copy this one and put it after the email check. But I actually want to change some of the text that gets returned back to the front end. So I want it to say incorrect email or incorrect password. So if the email field doesn't exist, or if it doesn't pass the isEmail function, it'll return incorrect email. And if the password doesn't exist, and if it's not at least 5 letters or 5 characters, it'll return incorrect password. Let's do a quick test from the front end to see if we can display those errors. Oh, God. All right, I just realized also that I actually have a little typo here. This should be spelled sign in. There we go. Now let's try hitting the request again. So now if I press the sign in button without any information, we'll get the errors that we expect. Okay, cool. So let's continue with the next step. So we need to check if the email they entered belongs in the database. And this is going to require us to do a query to the database. So first of all, even before we do that, let's just get the email and the password that they entered. And we can get that from request.body. Okay, so this is what the user entered. And now when we're sending a query, the format that I'm going to be doing this in, or that you've seen me do it in the last part, is we create a query object. So I'm going to create query for user, and it's going to be an object with 2 fields. It's going to have a text field, and we're going to put our query in here, and it's going to have the values field. Values is going to contain any variables that we want to pass into the query string. So the query that we want to write is select star, which means select everything, from users. So from the users table, where email, and this is the email column from the users table, equals $1. And $1 represents the first variable from the values array down here. And that's referring to what they entered in the form. Okay, now to actually run this query, I'm going to save it in query response. And remember, when we actually submit a query to the database, we need to use await pool.query. and we set up the pool function in a previous part if you want to go back and watch that. But now we're going to send it query for user, which is this object we created up here. And now we'll save list of users equals query response dot rows. And if list of users dot length is 0, then we want to return an error because the user doesn't exist in our system. So we're going to return res.send, actually res.status, because we're setting the status code to 401, which is an error code. And then .send, this is the actual error message that we're going to send. It's going to be inside of an array, and the object is going to have a parameter that specifies what this error is for. And this is for user not found. And the message that we want to display for this is incorrect email or password. So one thing that I'll probably do now is on the front end, we display errors based on what the parameter name is. So I'm going to take this parameter name, user not found, and in the sign-in component, I want this error to display at the top. So before the form container, we have an error section. And right now it's finding registration error because we copy pasted this from the registration component, but I'm going to put user not found here. So if there's an error, it'll call find error and it'll look for this name. And if there is something there, it'll display it. So now we can move on to the last part. So recall how we first of all stored the password in the database in the first place. When they're registering, we used bcrypt.hash to store the password hash into the database, right? We can actually use bcrypt to do the opposite. We can check if a password matches a password hash. And the details of how they implemented that aren't important to us. We're just going to use the function that comes from bcrypt. So here, first of all, what I'm going to do is set const possible user to list of users at 0. Because again, if we're at this line of code, we assume that we found some email in the database that matches what they entered. So right now, this is a possible user. So I'm going to set const check password match equal to await bcrypt.compare, and we want to give it two things to compare. First of all, we're going to give it password, which is again what the user entered, and we want to compare it to possible user dot password hash. Okay, and remember, possible user is what's coming from the database. So we're checking if this hash that's stored in the database works with the password they entered. So now we can simply do if not check password match, then we'll return an error. So I'm going to copy this line here and put it over here. So if they don't match, we'll send a user not found error, and that looks good. So if we do get to this point, we can actually just return the user info that we have now back to the front end. But before we do that, remember, right now possible user contains the password hash, and there's really no reason to send that back to the front end. So we can actually use destructuring to remove a field from an object. And we can do that like this. If I set const password hash equal to possible user, this will simply just get password hash from possible user, right? But if we do ... and we can give whatever variable name we want here, I'm going to say user without PW, like this. The value of user without PW is going to be whatever's from possible user without the password hash. And so that's what I'm going to be sending back to the front end. Let's copy this and put it here. I'm actually getting an error because I forgot the async keyword before the request handler. Actually, before I hit sign in, I just realized I have a couple typos like usual. So this password hash actually doesn't have a capital H here because we stored it in the database with a lowercase h. So accessing this variable previously wouldn't have worked. Now I'm going to hit sign in. So I recently registered with these random credentials, and let's see if I can sign in with them. Okay, great. Awesome. We can sign in. It's just great when stuff just works out, huh? That's a lie. I spent so much time debugging this before making the video, but anyways, we can see that we have user info stored inside of local storage as we expect, and the user info is also stored in Redux under logged in user. And this is exactly what's coming from the database. So now we can actually check off the first step of this video. And since we're signed in, let's work on the logout functionality. All right, so first of all, we know that we need a button up here that says sign out. So let's go ahead and add that. Let's open up the My Habits desktop file. And in here, we have a section that has all of our header items. So we're going to make a new header item here. And I'm going to make this one have a styled component called sign out button. All right. Now let's write the styled component above. Const sign up button equals styled dot button. And you guys know by now that I don't like writing out CSS. It's too boring. So I'm just going to copy what I have in my demo file and post it here. So basically we have the background color, which is that green color that we've used for previous buttons. We have the border none, border radius to 2 pixels to give it that kind of round edge on the buttons. Some padding of 10 pixels on the top, bottom, and 12 pixels on the right and left. And then color white. And we have this hover property so that if we hover over the button, our cursor turns into a pointer. And the text in here is going to be simply sign out. So let's take a look at that. Okay, it looks good. But now let's think of what actually is supposed to happen when we hit this sign out button. There's actually 2 things. If you want to pause for a second, see if you can do this on your own, go for it. But basically one of the things we need to do is get rid of the user that's stored inside of the local storage. And also if we go into Redux, we need to set our logged in user to null. That's going to log out the user from this page. And that is because in the parent component of my habits desktop, you may remember that we said, if there is no logged in user, then we're going to push to the sign out URL. So since we want to make changes to the Redux store, we need to dispatch an action. And you may recall that an action is simply a JavaScript object that has a type, and it could also carry what's called a payload, which is just some extra data you may want to send. So let's go back and open up the user slice.jsx, because here's where we handle all the Redux stuff for users. And in the create slice function in the reducer section, we're going to write our first reducer, and it's going to be for logout user. Now remember, a reducer is just a function that takes a state and returns a modified state. So what we want to do is set state.loggedInUser to null. And remember the second thing that I said we need to do? That is local storage dot remove item. And we want to remove the item with the key user info. Okay. So we have this reducer here. And the cool thing about create slice is whatever reducers we have in here, it'll automatically create the action creator functions for us. So in order to dispatch the logout user action creator, we can basically just export logout user. And I'll show you that down here. So we're going to say export logout user, and this is going to be coming from user slice.actions. The .actions property is something that create slice will automatically return for us. This should be export const. There we go. So now let's go use this inside of the My Habits desktop file. So at the top here, we can import logout user from components/user/user slice. All right. And now we simply need to dispatch this action to the store when the user presses the sign out button. In the sign out button, let's put an onClick function. And basically we'll put an arrow function here, and we're going to call a function that we'll make above called handle logout. So let's write that up here. Const handle logout equals a function. And all we simply do in here is dispatch logout user. Remember, this is the action creator that we just made in the user slice file. Looks like this auto completed to dispatch event. Let's get rid of that. And this dispatch function is actually going to be coming from use dispatch. So it should have automatically imported that use dispatch hook for us. We can see that here. I forgot my parentheses here because logout user is actually an action creator function. So we need to put the parentheses after a function. And now if I hit sign out, we're signed out. But there's a tiny check that I want to handle. And basically another little thing that I want to do is I want to display the user's name here and actually only display the sign out button if the user's signed in. So let me quickly grab the logged in user state. I can actually take it from the top of the sign in file. So we have the use selector that's going to select the user state. And from the user state, we take the logged in user. I can paste that at the top of My Habits desktop. And now I can change this header item a little bit. I can put some JavaScript and say, if logged in user has some value, I'll put an and, then we'll display logged in user dot first name. And also if the user is logged in, then we will display this button. So I'm going to wrap this entire thing around the sign out button. So now this button here, as well as the user's name, is only going to be displayed if this logged in user property is not null. Let's also just import use selector after use dispatch. And the N in first name should be lowercase. We'll say hi, whatever their name is. So let's take a look at that. Perfect. And the sign up functionality still works. That's awesome. So that checks off the second item that I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, I want to show you guys this little bug that kind of comes up here. If I get a bunch of errors in the register form and I go to the login page and do whatever here, if I go back to the register form, we still have the errors that display here. So we need a way to fix this bug. And also, we have not yet implemented JWT, which is JSON Web Tokens. And those are necessary to make sure that when the user sends future requests, we can validate them on the back end and make sure that they're actually a user that's signed in. So those topics will be covered in the next video. But yeah, I hope you guys were able to learn something from this video. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. And I hope you'll follow me along as I build out the rest of this system. So I'll see you then. Bye.